Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you as always on this fabulous Thursday in which we release our podcasts. Today, we are going for a little bit of a people and workforce analytics takeover. I've got a couple of members from our amazing people and workforce analytics team, and we're going to talk about how organizations almost benchmark themselves, because it's quite interesting, actually, because our team often go along to events. They talk to people analytics teams from a variety of different businesses in different industries and in different sectors. And quite often when you go along to these types of events, conferences, a lot of people go along to them to almost suss out, how am I performing? How is my team performing against the other guys that are out there in the market? And do you know what? Even from a marketing side, as a marketing person myself, I was at a conference this week. I did exactly the same thing. You're looking at how do we stack up? And so that's what we really wanted to zone in today. And today, to do that, I've got two members of our team. I will start off by introducing Aaron Lynch. Aaron, how are you doing, sir? You all right?
I'm very well, thank you, Chris.
Looking forward. This is your podcast debut. Looking forward to chatting and chewing the fat on all things people analytics.
I am. I've been waiting for the opportunity, so thank you for having me on.
Hey, it's great to have you on, man. Great to have you on. And joining us as well is Joe Clark, who is also from our analytics team. I'll let you in behind the scenes a little bit here, listener. If you search Joe on LinkedIn, that's not her full name, Joanna Clark, and I'm not prepared to go through her full name. Joanna, why don't you actually say your full name so I don't butcher it? But welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me. Well, for those people who want to know what my last name is, please look me up on LinkedIn and then be surprised or not.
So we're going to talk, and I'm going to start with you, Joe, in a minute on this whole benchmarking thing and, how do people assess how mature they are? How do they benchmark themselves? But before we do that, we have a little tradition on this podcast. As you know, having already been on the pod before, it's our fundamentally different question. So we're going to kick off with that today. In Colombia, so I read something this week, in Colombia, police officers removed a boa constrictor from the engine of a truck. It was a 10-foot boa constrictor. Now, I don't like snakes. So my fundamentally different question I'm going to ask you both, I'm actually going to start with Aaron, and then I'm going to start with you. No, I'm going to start with you, Joe, actually, ladies first. But from my point of view, if there's one thing that I would not like to find in my car, in the garage, in my back garden, or anywhere really, it is snakes, because they terrify the life out of me. But Joe, is there one type of animal that you would not like to find in a surprising place?
I think I'm not alone to say that spiders is not something I would like to see. I will run screaming, grab a slipper. I'm sorry for any animal cruelty, but spiders and me, we're not friends.
Aaron, are you a snake lover? Are you a spider lover? Would you be absolutely fine? Or is there anything that would haunt you if you suddenly came across it by surprise?
Well, I just like snakes and spiders. And I walked into an Airbnb in Mexico once, and I was shown into our room, and smack bang in the middle of the room was a tarantula about the size of my fist, and I froze. I've never had to before, but I actually froze, couldn't move. I was stiff as a board. So yeah, I'm also a spider non-advocate.
Yeah, I mean, that is pretty scary, to be fair. And even if you knew that they weren't poisonous or venomous, just the one that's the size of your fist, I mean, that's just enough to, even if your brain tells you it, yeah. But anyway, interesting. So we got two spider phobias and then one snake phobia. But what isn't a phobia, what is something that should be embraced, is people analytics and also being able to assess yourself against your competitors. So I'm going to start with you, Joe, for this first question. I wanted to talk about, how do, in your experience, people analytics team kind of assess how mature they are, how far they are along in their journey? Because you must come across plenty of teams that are at all different stages. So what's a good way of assessing how mature you are as a business?
Traditionally, organizations often, what we hear, and I've also experienced this myself, they would assess their people analytics team by their statistical competency. So you start off with descriptive, then you go into diagnostic, then predictive and prescriptive. So everyone talks about, oh, we need predictive analytics, and you're a great analytics team, or your HR data is great if you can do predictive analytics. But we don't quite agree with it because it's not flexible enough to organizations' needs. So, for instance, just because you have predictive or prescriptive abilities in your analytics, it doesn't actually mean that your HR analytics function is well developed, because you could be answering the wrong question. You could actually be spending a lot of time cleaning your data because your systems are not set up right. If you're not aligned to the overall business strategy, yes, you have predictive capabilities, but it's not driving any business need. So that is the traditional way of assessing HR analytics, which is very closely aligned with statistical competencies, but it's very limited to that.
Aaron, is there anything from your side, from your experience and what you've seen when you've spoken to people analytics teams, how they assess how mature they are? Anything you want to build on from what Joe's just said?
Yeah, maybe a slightly different take is from the users of that data. So speaking sometimes to HR leadership teams and asking them, do they get the information that they need from their analytics teams directly? And it's quite surprising, but often the answer is they're not really that comfortable that they're getting the right data, or that they don't have the trust in the data, or maybe they aren't getting it in the right format for them to quickly and easily digest it. So I think that in terms of benchmarking, they're aware that they're not maybe getting what they could be getting in an ideal world, but also they're probably not aware of what is possible and what is the ideal state.
Certainly. And in terms of, so you've got organizations that you guys speak to, you go along to conferences, you talk to them about how are we stacking up against other businesses. And I guess that's one of the benefits that we have at Lace Partners, because we speak to so many different teams as part of just the role that we do as a HR consultancy. If we look at the specific pain points that organizations come across, what are, in your experiences, and actually, Aaron, I'll start with you on this one and then get Joe to chip in. What are the kind of types of pain points when organizations come to you when they're looking at how they assess their maturity and their benchmarking? What do they talk to you guys about?
I think firstly, it's to frame it, it's quite a new concept for some organizations. So it's often they're coming at it from a position of, we don't really know where we are generally, not even compared to other competitors or compared to other industries out there. They're just understanding where they are on their journey. So I think the fact that it is reasonably new as a function in a lot of organizations means that in terms of benchmarking, it's quite difficult. So they just need a bit of understanding about kind of where they're at. And, following on from that, they just don't know what they don't know, right? So, for example, have they covered some of the more kind of basic things like putting in a strategy and ensuring that strategy is maybe linked to some of their broader goals, looking at, do they have the right capability and the right assets in place in terms of their workforce, so they have the right skills in place, and then also looking at their systems and their tools, what do they use? So these are all questions where they might not have the answers, and they want to explore a little bit more about what's out there, but ultimately it's difficult for them to understand where they're at in terms of where they're trying to get to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly. Do you know what, from my perspective, so when I think about when I go along to conferences or I go along to events to talk to people about where's my team at in terms of our capabilities and things like that, quite often I feel like the bit that almost as a person that's looking over the fence that I often think, I wonder if are we behind the times? I often default to what's the latest tech, what's the latest systems. Is that a common sort of thing that you see amongst people analytics teams? It's like, are we missing out on the latest new whizzy thing? Or is it like, because you talked about the capabilities, I mean, you look at that, but my default tends to be, just me personally, tends to be, what's the latest sort of tools that are out there?
Yeah, and I think in some cases, yes, but I think that's, in a lot of cases, that's probably a stretch. So it's not so much as do we, what tool should we be implementing? It's sometimes a question of, do we have anything in place at present? Of what we do have in place, are we actually using it in an optimal way? And then, even understanding that, what do you have access to currently? And can we optimize that? And then maybe create a bit of a roadmap to get you to a position where you can organize your data to start leveraging some of the more sophisticated tools. It's a bit of a broader conversation, but I guess what I've found in my experience is there's a lot of scope for optimizing and using existing tools and just building understanding about how better to leverage data before they go and pursue, the tier one, best products out there.
Yeah, certainly. And Joe, I want to bring you in on this as well, because that's really interesting. And we've talked about this across some of our other functions as well. So, for example, I know that we've jumped on a podcast. I've jumped on a podcast with Chris Kirby and Simon from our payroll team, and they've talked about the same sort of thing. Like, quite often, it's not just that the payroll system is broken and you need a new system. It's actually you need to look inward to how do we get the most out of our system. But Joe, so I wanted to get your thoughts from that perspective in terms of do people tend to default towards what's the latest tool, or what's your kind of experience in terms of their pain points based on what Aaron had just talked about with capabilities and tools and things like that?
Well, I think some of the pain points are there's increased pressures for HR to deliver more data and to get better data, because that's what we see in other functions, for instance, sales, marketing, finance, every other branch of the business. So HR needs to, or is expected to also now come with data. And HR teams, I think they know what they want. They know what the output is. And that's why tech AI is so tempting, because you get sold this dashboard at the end, or it looks pretty, but what is often forgotten is that how do you get there? So how does that data enter into that system? What is the question or this data is supposed to be answering? And that's why bringing it back to the benchmarking of descriptive, predictive data doesn't really work, because that only talks about the output. But what are you putting into it? And is it actually driving what you need? Not every organization will need the same level of analytics. So it's tempting to look at the new shiny toy, but sometimes it's just about thinking about the foundations. And people analytics, it's also about skills and behaviors. So you need to think, are we set up in an organization that if we do have all this data and these shiny tools and whatnot, are people actually going to use it? Do we have the behaviors in place for the organization to make use of it?
Can I ask one more quick question on that before we then move on to our approach in terms of frameworks that we've got, or the Navigator we'll talk about in a little bit as well, in terms of how businesses can take a look at themselves. And that question really is about when new senior leadership people enter into an organization, does that factor in to some of the pain points that businesses they think about? So if you've got like a new CPO or someone at the top of the organization coming in, is there a tendency to almost instantly be a little bit, Joe, I'll stick with you on this one, be a little bit like, right, I'm coming in, I want to make my mark. How can I rip it up and start again? Or have you seen examples of that?
I think it leads back to what I said just earlier, is there's increased pressure to get data, and it's becoming more and more important to give that to the business. So if there is a new CPO or CEO, they will want to look at the analytics team and think, how can we make this better? How can we improve it? But also look back in reflection and see what are we maybe not doing so well. So when you assess your team and also see how mature you are, it allows you then to also build that strategy. So if you're new, you would want to build a strategy or build on the old one or see where you're going. So that's really what benchmarking would allow you to do.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about how we kind of approach things. And Aaron, I'll start off with you, if that's all right, mate. Talk to me a little bit about, because we talk internally about a LACE maturity framework. So can you give a little bit of colour and perhaps give a little bit of a background to those people listening in when we're talking about a maturity framework? Like, what is it and how does it help businesses?
Yeah, sure. And this is a great piece of work that's been done by LACE. We've taken, following on from Joe's comments about what might be viewed as a bit of an outdated model and a bit of an outdated approach to people analytics. We've kind of taken a look at it and revamped that. And when you reference our maturity framework, what that ultimately is kind of a view of 6 themes or concepts that we'd like to kind of have a bit of a deeper dive into with clients, and understand a little bit more about those and separate those out and explore those in a bit of detail. And I can go into those in a bit of detail, but they are ultimately strategy. So the goal here is just to understand, is there a strategy in place and how well is that embedded in the organization, and how well does that align with the overall organization's goals? So that's first and foremost. And then we look at systems and data. So as we referenced previously, what tools are in place, how effectively are they managing the data, how effectively are they using these tools, where is their data centralized, how accurate is it, all those things. That's really important, and goes back to Joe's point about the input focus, I think. We also look at reporting and analytics, and that's really about the impact of analytics on decision making. So not only asking if it's useful, but is it also accessible? So do leadership have the ability to quickly and easily digest and access that information and then use that to kind of make those decisions? We look at operating model, and that's really about the structure and the governance of the function. So the roles, the responsibilities, how well they collaborate with other parts of the business. And we look at skills and behaviors. So that's obviously looking at within the team, what level of skill do we have? Talking about things like data literacy and, the ability to stay up with data trends. And in terms of benchmarking, are we keeping up to date? Are we keeping up to date with our competitors? Are we up to date with modern trends and things like that? And do we have the people that are in place to support that and to make sure that we do stay on track? And then finally is self-perception. So this is really about ensuring that the organization has an opportunity to reflect on their analytics capabilities and for them to identify areas where they think they're performing well and areas where they think they might need to, put some more focus and some more emphasis and potentially some more investment as well. So that's broadly, very high level. That's the kind of 6 themes that sit within the LACE maturity framework that we've applied to the Navigator as a tool.
Yeah, and I'm going to get Joe to talk about the Navigator in a second. But Joe, I think it's quite an interesting thing because we talked 5-10 minutes ago around, I said I fall guilty of this as well as a marketing person. You're always looking at kind of like, what's the next sort of whizzy tool that could really take us to that next level? But I think what's quite interesting about this maturity framework, essentially it's taking a look at yourself and using those key 6 points as Aaron mentioned, and it's recognizing that it's not just about finding the latest sort of whizzy tool, as I described, that's going to sound good and look good and makes you feel like we're ahead of the competition or we're ahead of where others are in the market. It's actually so much deeper than that. And so what we do, I guess, and Joe, I want you to talk a little bit about Navigator, if that's all right. So effectively as Aaron's described, that's the taking a look at yourself and choosing these 6 areas to try and assess, okay, where are we at in terms of our maturity of a people analytics function? But we then create this Navigator. So can you explain a little bit to our listeners just about what it is? Like, sounds very, very impressive, a Navigator, the people analytics Navigator. But talk to me a little bit about what it is and how it helps.
So the name came about because we think that the analytics journey is not one directional. So unlike the old framework of you end with a prescriptive and that's your ultimate, the thing about our framework is and also that's the importance of the last section that Aaron mentioned, the perception, because it's about where do you want to go. So it's not just about this is what a top organization is. It's just not one size fits all. There's going to be different strategies. There's different business needs. Are you growth focused business, or is it more, are you trying to become more efficient? So it really depends on what the needs are. And that's why it's called a Navigator. So it's a really simple and free survey that takes under 10 minutes to complete. It's straightforward set of questions. Ideally, we'd have multiple responses from various stakeholders of an organization so that we can build this holistic view of the analytics function and also take different viewpoints into consideration. It allows us to play back to clients the strengths in some areas that they might want to focus on in the future for longer term if there is scope for partnering with LACE. It also represents the first step in a longer process. So it would be something that we'd be using to assess and provide advice to clients then as well on how to build a people analytics function. So the free version is, of course, a shorter version of that to give you a flavor and the tools to start that conversation. But we use it then also to do a bigger, deeper dive into the people analytics function.
Okay, perfect. So, Aaron, just as we wrap up today, do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about how they can get access to it? Is it a reach out to you? And we've got a couple of bits of content that we're going to push out just to explain and expand on that, aren't we?
Yes, so it is a completely free tool. It's going to be pushed out in a link within a blog, I think that's coming out quite shortly, Chris. That'll follow up on the back of this podcast. But if you'd prefer, if you're really eager, just reach out to us directly and we can provide you with that. As Joe mentioned, great to get one response from an organization, but even better to get more. And then we can build out that bigger picture and those insights and those playbacks are just that more holistic and more powerful. So, look forward to getting some responses.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much to both Aaron and Joe for giving us a little bit of an insight there. I always think it's really interesting how as functions, different functions they often want a similar sort of output in terms of how they benchmark. And talked about from a marketing perspective, you're always looking at how do we stack up? HR teams will do this, finance teams will do this, IT teams will do this. But this is an opportunity to really zone in on the people analytics and the people data side of it. So if you want to reach out to Aaron or Joe, we'll put their details, their contact details in the show notes. You can also follow them on LinkedIn, and we'll happily share some more of that information. Just reach out to us. But from myself, thank you very much, Joe, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And Aaron, always a pleasure, sir.
Thank you so much, Chris.
You can, of course, get this podcast wherever you get podcasts. You can download it. I often listen to podcasts. I don't listen to podcasts of myself when I go running, but I do enjoy a podcast when I go out running. So give that one a try. Reach out to us if you want to chat about your people analytics function. And hopefully we will speak to you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.